Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Welcome to ErgoHour, our dedicated webinar to workplace ergonomics and safety. I'm Sophia, Head of Customer Success here at Tumiki, for those of you who are attending ErgoHour for the first time. And we have Amonat with us here. She's our amazing Customer Success Manager and a board-certified ergonomist on top of that here at Tumiki. And while we still have people joining, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar is getting recorded, so we'll be sharing the recording with all of attendees afterwards. And also feel free to use the Q&A function to submit any questions you have during the presentation, and we'll address as many as we can during the Q&A session afterwards. I'll also run a poll for all of you during the session on additional topics that you would like us to cover next time, so feel free to submit if interested. And Amonat, it's great to have you here today.
Yes, thanks for having me, Sophia.
Excited. How it's going?
Good.
Excited as well.
Yeah.
Before we dive into today's topic, could you please give us a quick recap of what we discussed last time and where we left off, because this would help, provide some context for today's listeners.
Definitely. So I know it's been I think 2 months at this point since we all last convened for this. So I'll give you a high-level summary of what we went over last time. During our last session, we discussed the key elements that would help you lay the groundwork for establishing a successful ergonomics program. So these included setting good goals and objectives for your program, identifying key stakeholders and who you should involve in the different aspects of the program, and also assigning jobs and responsibilities. And then we kind of ended the discussion by talking about different risk identification strategies. So if you weren't able to attend last time, or you would like a refresher on some of that material, you can actually access the recording in the blog section of the Tumiki website. And there is an article and a recording of the video there. So today, what we're going to do is cover strategies for coming up with interventions and implementing solutions. Before we continue, I highlighted this the last time, but I also want to note again that an ergonomics program can also be thought of as an ergonomics process, meaning it's not linear always. There are definitely aspects of the program that you're going to write down, and those are instructions. But that program is also going to contain processes as a part of your program, but those are the things that can change, and they're not always set in stone. You'll have to revisit certain elements of your program as you have information, as you've made progress, and as your priorities change.
That makes sense. Thank you. Sounds great. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to examining and developing different solutions, what framework do you suggest to use, and what would be the key considerations in that choice?
So ideally, when you think of a job, in a perfect world, it would already be designed to take into account the capabilities of the workforce. However, we know this isn't the case, and most of the time we are reacting to issues that are already a part of the work process. So to address issues you've identified through your risk assessment, you want to think about the different types of controls, how effective they are, and how feasible they are to implement. So for those of you in the world of environmental health and safety, you are probably familiar with the concept of the hierarchy of controls. It's a model that can help you identify and rank solutions. These controls, from most effective to least effective, include elimination, substitution, engineering controls, administrative controls, and personal protective equipment, or PPE for short.
Got it. That makes sense. So what would be the most effective, like the very first solution you would consider?
That's a good question. So typically this is shown in a pyramid. And at the top you have elimination, which are controls that remove the risk completely. Substitution, which replaces the risk with something less risky. And then engineering controls, which isolate the risk or change the way a job or process is done to help reduce risk. In a traditional safety model, the elimination, substitution, and engineering controls, the line is a little bit clearer. They're a little bit more distinct. However, since the causes of ergonomic risk factors tend to be multifactorial, in ergonomics, these controls tend to be lumped together a bit more. So a good way to think about all three of these as a unit is that they are making a physical change to the workplace that eliminates or reduces the exposure to a risk factor. And then when you think about the impact of these controls, I had mentioned, they tend to be the most effective, but it's with anything, if it's too hard to implement, the success is not, it's not going to be as great as if they are easier. So a useful comparison that I think about when I think about kind of recommendations is the goal that food scientists strive for when they think about food alternatives, such as plant-based substitution for hamburgers, right? The beef alternatives need to taste the same or better and cost the same or cheaper in order for people to really buy into them. So when thinking about ergonomic controls, they are the most impactful when they can be implemented without making the work process more difficult or lengthy.
Love that analogy. Thank you for sharing. So that sounds pretty good to me. Are there any drawbacks to these controls?
Yes, with everything, there's pros and cons, right? So elimination, substitution, and engineering controls are going to be, again, the most effective solutions when you look at how much risk they can reduce and their capacity to improve quality and productivity. But they can be costly and time-consuming to implement and typically involve coordination of multiple departments. So these types of controls, especially those that eliminate the source of the risk altogether, are definitely easier to consider or even get buy-in for when you're kind of initially in that design phase. So when your organization has already committed resources and put effort into redesigning or upgrading elements of the workplace, is typically when you'll get buy-in for these controls. But if you try to recommend them when you're not in that phase, it can really be hard to push them through. And if you don't have the resources to implement these controls now, it's not like you can never do them, but something that I've always taken into practice is giving that long-term recommendation where you can recommend something along the lines of, I recommend this for now, but for future design, consider X, Y, or Z.
Absolutely. Yeah, agreed. And that clarifies it well. I think, the earlier you can detect elements that need redesign, the easier and cheaper it is to implement. So what would be the next option after we've considered that?
So the next set of controls to consider would be administrative controls, which change how people work or the length of time that they're exposed to a risk factor. So examples of these include training, job rotation, rest breaks, and then maybe adjusting a process. So a kind of easy example or a very simplistic example of an administrative control would be training workers to identify risk factors and equip them with the knowledge to change the way they work to reduce those risk factors. So it can be something as simple as turning your whole body to perform a task, as opposed to turning at your trunk when you're doing manual handling tasks.
That would be twisting, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then administrative controls, they can be pretty cheap to implement initially, but they're costly to sustain. And they also tend not to be as effective because a lot of the time they are actually just relying on employee behavior and the capacity for behavior changes. It's going to rely on training, et cetera, and motivation, but it is also extremely limited by the design of the work environment. And then I know job rotation is another common recommendation that people will make, but it's something to keep in mind is that job rotation will only work if the rotation involves performing a task that has different risk factors, right? So an example is, if someone's working at an assembly line and you want to rotate them from a job that involves repetitive hand or wrist motions, and you move them to another job that still has repetitive hand or wrist motions, it will likely be ineffective, right? Because they're still experiencing the same risk factors. So in some work environments and organizations, job rotation can work well if you have that variety of tasks, but if you don't, then it's not necessarily the best solution.
Absolutely. This is very insightful. I appreciate the detail on it. So what would happen if, administrative controls wouldn't work for you? What would you consider next?
The last set of controls on the hierarchy of controls, again, is PPE, which is personal protective equipment. So This is essentially what you would provide to an employee to protect themselves from the risk factor if you can't eliminate it or really design it out. And ergonomic PPE is slightly different than other things that you would see in health and safety, but it includes things like knee pads if you have to kneel on the floor for prolonged periods, or anti-fatigue mats if you have to stand for prolonged periods. In general, at the beginning, they can seem pretty cheap to implement. So it might seem like you've kind of solved everything, but the longer the time goes on, the more costly they become to sustain. And they're also not as effective because they're really just reducing the risk, not completely eliminating it. So you should really only rely on PPE if other controls are not an option, because they have, especially in the ergo world, have limited impact when addressing some risk factors, and also they can introduce new risk factors. So again, another very simple example is oftentimes people that have to work in cold environments will be given gloves to help, reduce the risk factors associated with cold temperatures. But a lot of times those gloves are bulky. So if they have to do any fine motor control, it really decreases their capacity to do that. It also can make it harder to grip an object.
That's right. Yeah, okay. Thank you for sharing this. Now I can see the whole picture. So how do you go about applying these solutions? Do you go like one by one, or do you find a combined approach? And I also have sort of like another question that's related to that. Like, how do you prioritize the application of these solutions if you do find a combined approach?
That's a good question. So it's going to seem like I'm saying this now to you, and it's going to seem really simple. So I just want to make sure that you're not like demoralized when you go back to your desk and try to implement one of these. It takes time to really nail this down. And, depending on the scenario, sometimes this will be really easy and sometimes it won't. So I want you to keep that in the back of your mind. But we all know this, ergonomic risk factors can be multifactorial. So you will likely have to try a combination of solutions and implement them in phases. So the first thing I would do is just start by brainstorming solutions as immediate, intermediate, and long-term solutions. While you're doing this, also make notes about the kind of pros and cons of each solution and any barriers that you will have to address before they can be implemented. Okay. And for immediate recommendations, I guess I can give an example, kind of how these three will break down, but your immediate recommendations will probably fall under administrative controls or PPE. So an example of PPE that can be easily implemented would be applying padding to a hard surface or sharp corner that creates some contact stress. So if you're familiar with laboratory environments, sometimes people work in those biosafety cabinets, and they end up with their wrists on the corner of those cabinets throughout the day. So putting some padding there can be an example of some risk reduction that's easy to implement. An administrative control you could immediately recommend is to provide ergonomics trainings to individuals to kind of evaluate them. The training is extremely important. However, it relies on employee behavior, and in order for it to be effective, you have to provide it consistently. So you wouldn't stop here with your recommendations, and you should make some ones for the long term as well. And then your intermediate and long-term recommendations will probably be, the elimination, substitution, or engineering controls that we discussed. More or less, they are making changes to the work environment that will take longer to see through or may require approval from multiple parties. So examples of these solutions would include maybe something in the intermediate would be, rearrange boxes on a shelf. So you're not performing frequent or heavy lifts that require bending, towards the ground or reaching overhead. Potentially, you could improve the lighting in the workspace to improve task visibility. You could purchase some lift assist devices that are more kind of mechanical in nature and kind of, decrease the force associated with some tasks. You could also, redesign some of, work with your kind of your vendors, if that's where you're getting this material from, or even your internal engineering teams to switch to lighter weight packaging materials. So those are all examples of changes that in the long term will make the most difference, but they may require a lot of effort.
Got it. Great examples,
Yeah.
Amonat. Thank you for breaking down that for us. I actually made a note of a question one of the listeners asked us last time, and I thought it's a good one. So how do you go about writing recommendations in lay terms for easing adoption at worker level, for example?
Good question. This is something that I think even, most ergonomists or like health and safety specialists, because you're normally speaking to people who, speak the same language as you, we all kind of struggle with sometimes. And the best thing to do with like anything is just take a step back, reset, right? A technique that helps me communicate and even think about complicated problems is first clearly outlining what I observed and then explaining why that observation is an issue. This can be extremely helpful for making a recommendation because it puts everyone on the same page as you before you start kind of jumping into everything that they need to change about how they're working. So again, I would first clearly spell out what the risk I observed was without, getting too technical. Then I would explain the consequences of that specific risk factor. And then I would make my recommendation and explain how that recommendation is actually going to reduce the exposure or eliminate the exposure of the risk factor. So without that explanation of why that's going to help them, the adoption is always going to be low because then you're just telling someone what they should be doing as opposed to giving them advice that's going to help them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I fully agree with that. Can you please share an example of such recommendation?
Yep. Sure. I'll keep it simple. So let's say that during a risk assessment, it was identified that someone was sitting too far away from their work tools, right? And this is a simple example, but it's a very common one. My observation would be that I noticed that this employee was sitting far away from their workbench. And because the tools that they're using are on this workbench, this is causing them to lean forward and overreach with their upper arm. My explanation would be that if this is done for prolonged periods, these postures are associated with a lot of upper arm and shoulder strain and lower back discomfort. And my recommendation would be for this person to sit closer to their workstation so you can decrease how much you're leaning forward and how much, much you're extending your arms.
Perfect. That really helps and makes sense. So when reviewing the tasks that have ergonomic risks, many of our customers are asking us what would they do, if they're not able to apply, elimination, substitution, engineering solutions. And one of the things that, we recommend in that case sometimes is to double down on training. So can you please elaborate on this solution and, share your thoughts on how important it is?
So training, even though I listed it as an administrative control, is extremely important. It should always be a part of your plan. So like you mentioned, elimination, substitution, engineering controls are not always possible. And that's when people would turn to those administrative controls. But I would still always incorporate some level of training in everything you're doing. In order to change behavior, it's important for workers and managers to be able to identify and help correct ergonomic risk factors, right? Especially if you want to involve them in your process. And I'll kind of dive into that a little bit more. Without really knowing why something is wrong, it's really, even if you gave someone all of the ergonomic equipment in the world, you will still probably not see the full extent of your results unless you supply that training and kind of give people the awareness that they need to be able to correct things they're doing. So if they know what to look out for, the workers can not only correct their own behavior, but they can help you identify a solution, and the managers can then help them implement those solutions. So the key thing here is, if they know what to look out for, right? So this is going to require a baseline of training. It's not going to work for you to just show up somewhere and be like, hey, we have an ergonomic initiative this year, look out for ergonomic problems and let us know. You have to explain what those problems are, how they can identify them, and what the consequences of those problems are.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Agreed with you. So what types of training programs have you seen be used in the industry?
So there are a lot of ways to approach training. And when you're deciding how you want to do this, it might make sense to start small, but everyone's going to have different needs, and you're probably going to have to adapt your approach as time goes on. But the two most common I've seen are kind of basic ergonomics awareness style trainings, and then more advanced risk identification trainings. So the awareness trainings on a very high level kind of help employees understand the signs and symptoms of work-related musculoskeletal disorders, the impact of those MSDs, the common risk factors or issues in their line of work. So, you know, it's something that I can be tempted to do if I'm given a stage for too long, is go on and on and on about all the different types of risk factors. But if you're really just doing an awareness style training, you want to make sure to try to limit it to the risk factors that those specific workers are exposed to, because, you know, we only have the capacity to take in so much, especially if this isn't your main job, right? You're really just providing that training, and we want them to be able to pick out what's relevant in their environment. You also want to, so if you don't have this yet, start thinking about these. But if you do, it's also important to include your organization's policies and procedures related to ergonomics. So I've had a lot of experience kind of on the consulting end, but also with an in-house program. And a lot of the times you would get the feedback that I didn't even know this program existed, right? I wish I knew when I started, so I could have been proactive and, you know, prevented some of the discomfort development. So especially the larger the organization gets, or even small ones where you don't have a lot of communication channels, a lot of these programs can be really well built out, but people don't know about them. So if you're doing a training, you want to provide that information. And you also want to include how they can request help. So one avenue for providing these types of trainings can be done for new hires, right? And a lot of kind of like the more mature ergonomics programs have started to do this because they have the resources to be able to manage, you know, this type of like the flow of these requests. But maybe if you are, you know, just starting to build out your kind of your program, maybe you can provide training for people that either reach out to you or they have expressed some levels of discomfort. And all of these things, if you kind of think back to the first session when we were talking about setting KPIs, ergonomics trainings can serve as leading indicators for your program. So that's on your end a benefit as well. And
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then the more advanced risk identification trainings, these are a little bit less common. This is going to depend on the size of your program, who you're involving, et cetera. But a lot of larger organizations, especially when they have different styles of work, right? They might have office employees, they might have lab employees, and then manufacturing employees. You know, a lot of those places will implement a grassroots training program where they select individuals to learn how to identify risk factors and come up with solutions. And these people tend to be your eyes and ears on the floor. And a good audience for that type of training would be maybe a safety specialist, a floor supervisor, or maybe someone that's just expressed interest, right, in the safety of their work environment.
Yeah. And I'm hearing that, you know, there's definitely a variety of trainings, and, you know, its application depends on the context, pain points, goals, I guess. That sounds good. Thank you very much for walking us through that. I have another question for you. How would you go about finding the right equipment and solutions?
Yeah, so this one, I don't unfortunately have a formulaic answer to. The ease with which you will find the right equipment will depend on so many things, including the complexity of the task, the work environment requirements, and potentially even like your procurement guidelines internally, right? So for example, there may be a situation where the solution is as easy as purchasing a spring-loaded pallet in a warehouse. And for that scenario, you were able to complete that within a few weeks. But maybe you change the environment now to a clean room in a laboratory environment where you have to be everything has to be sterilized, right? So now your process is complicated by now having to find a similar solution that needs to be made out of certain materials that can actually be cleaned using whatever sterilization solution they're using, and also something that's easier to clean, right? Something that has too many nooks and crannies won't work. So then you'll probably have to turn to a vendor that specializes in that product, but then you run the risk of that vendor not being set up within your procurement environment, which will lengthen the process of actually being able to purchase from them. So the kind of finding the right equipment it's going to look different every time you do this, but there are some things that can make this process easier in the event that the solution you are looking for is not very straightforward. So the first place that I would start is by doing some industry research. You can Google the issue and then look for information from reputable sources like OSHA, or you could engage with your network by attending conferences or maybe even through LinkedIn with people who are kind of working in similar industries and see if they've experienced similar issues and how they would address them. So, a lot of like OSHA will, or, organizations similar to that will publish case studies from, people who have offered up that information. Conferences will, like the Applied Ergonomics conference, for example, that we went to earlier this year, they had people showcasing how they involved their employees and for, for kind of issues they were facing. And that is an invaluable way to kind of make changes within your organization as well. If you more or less know what you need to do, but you could use some help on or guidance on features or criteria that certain equipment needs to meet, like that equipment that you're looking at needs to meet, you could also reference some kind of resources that are available through different standard development organizations. So the International Standards Organization, ISO, BIFMA, the American National Standards Institute, Human Factors and Ergonomic Society, OSHA, et cetera. They all publish standards. So BIFMA, for example, will publish, ANSI have details on what you should look for in an ergonomic task chair, and it'll give you measurements, et cetera. And if you want to kind of narrow down the standards, because they can be quite overwhelming because there are standards for very specific things, the Human Factors and Ergonomic Society actually has a list of technical standards on their website to kind of help you narrow down that search. And then, you can also kind of look at other third-party resources. So for example, the National Safety Council has put together the Tech Hub Marketplace, which is a directory of different technology solutions available in the health and safety and ergonomics field. And, you might also be working with an ergonomics consultant, right? They'll probably have a wealth of information about where you can find some solutions.
That's right, Amona. Thank you very much for sharing this. I would assume you got to ask, a number of questions before, you start your research, and also then I'll decide, who to involve in this process. So how would you go about that?
So when you're looking for some solutions, you want to think about, what type of control is that, that are you trying to implement? Think back to the hierarchy of controls. Do you have the resources to kind of make those substitutions and engineering controls, or do you need something, do you need to kind of reference those administrative controls first? You want to think about, will that solution introduce any new risks? Will it significantly impact productivity? How feasible will it be to be implemented? Do you have the budget to implement it? And lastly, and this is probably the most important part, is to figure out who needs to be involved. So all the way from coming up and brainstorming ideas for the solution to procurement and implementation, you kind of need to take a step back and identify who you need to work with. So I want to spend some time, this is a good segue actually, to talk about kind of this approach called participatory ergonomics. So there is a common method for implementing ergonomics programs and processes, and it's called participatory ergonomics. In practice, it can look like a lot of different things. So in a general sense, it's a macro ergonomic method for designing and analyzing your workstations and processes that involve participation of the worker. It stems from the theory that workers may have knowledge about the workplace that managers or decision makers lack, and that knowledge can be used to improve organizational performance because it enhances the flow of information. So no one knows the job better than the worker, and therefore they are invaluable resources when developing solutions. Also, when you involve the worker, it gives them a sense of ownership and autonomy, which can increase the acceptance of any solutions or changes, but also can increase employee satisfaction. And in fact, a lot of research has shown that implementation of decisions are enhanced by participating in the decision. It's also important to note that no single approach will be effective under all circumstances. So your approach will depend on a number of factors. Specifically, when you are thinking about the intervention and implementation process, there are a couple of different factors that are important to consider. One is the scope of the initiative. So is this just for one issue or incident, or are you looking to embed some sort of system for participatory ergonomics in your process? You want to think about how involved the workers will be. So will this be a part of their job duties, or will the involvement kind of be voluntary or informal? You'll also have to decide how much decision-making power the workers will have. So this is really important, right? Are there some processes where workers will have the autonomy to make changes themselves, or does the decision-making power kind of lay on the managers and or supervisors? And like I said, every approach is going to look different. There's no wrong or 100% correct way of, everyone has to kind of follow this process. You have to look at your organization and what works, and also, the specific tasks that you're looking at and what works. Sometimes it's fine for the worker to have the decision-making power, other times it's not. So these are all things you have to consider. And some examples of what this kind of like different involvement can look like. One is a consultative approach, which involves the workers just kind of consulting with you. So maybe you're the health and safety manager and you're leading the charge, and you informally or formally kind of meet with them to promote discussion about how to improve processes. So an example of this is Kaizen groups, right? Here, the workers are involved with suggestions, but may not necessarily have the skills for kind of analyzing the task, right? You might have to present the risk factors and the kind of hazards to them and be like, this is what we're trying to solve. How do we do this? And they also don't have the decision-making authority here. Another approach is a more substantive participation style by means of either job enrichment or work groups and steering committees. Job enrichment adds dimensions to existing jobs by giving workers new skills and responsibilities. Work groups can help you kind of assess the job and help come up with solutions. So work groups might be people that you would kind of train through a grassroots effort, right? And then those people are out on the floors, kind of identifying the risks and brainstorming those solutions. And then they might present those solutions to steering committees, which can help decide which one of the solutions to implement. So in these scenarios, the employees are more involved because they've been trained on how to analyze and come up with recommendations. And their recommendations have more influence on the decision makers than if you were just doing kind of an informal consultative practice.
Excellent, Amona. Thank you. That makes things much clearer, at least to me, and I hope for our listeners as well. And I really like that inclusivity factor that's added to the approach. So how do you ensure, the success of this participatory approach overall?
Yeah, so for one, you're going to need commitment from management and kind of leadership in general. They need to be supportive and committed. If they are not comfortable with giving workers some control over the process, the participatory process will not be successful, right? You also want to make sure that each team member has clearly defined expectations. Otherwise, it's really hard to hold anyone accountable, and it's hard for change to kind of to happen. And then, if you are involving your workers, you need to give them some level of confidence that they can do this. So when I say confidence, I mean by way of knowledge and training. You need to provide the workers with the knowledge and skills. You need to confidently look for solution or identify risks, look for solution, implement those solutions. And then also once, they've been implemented as a pilot, evaluate them. So for example, if you are using work groups, you need to ensure that members have been trained on how to identify risk factors, conduct assessments, and develop solutions. And then lastly, it's important to involve all of the relevant stakeholders. So cross-functional teams are typically needed for logistical reasons, but also just for better adoption. Common stakeholders will include, one, we've talked about this a lot, the workers, because they can help you identify. They can be your, again, they're your eyes and ears, right? They know what's going on more than a manager would. Your EHS specialists and ergonomists can help serve as advisors to the whole process. Your supervisors and managers can make sure they can make kind of give they add in like the decision-making power, and they can help implement solutions that are presented, and they can also help you liaise between other departments. Engineering and quality control specialists can be helpful in kind of brainstorming, you know, a new design, or help you bring those design changes into fruition. Representatives from other sites, so maybe you have an EHS counterpart, you know, let's say you're working from New York and you have your EHS counterpart in California. You can always share, you know, what you're seeing. So, and you know, they might have slightly different things they're working with, but chances are, if they're working within the same organization, they probably also have a lot of the same challenges. And then the last one, where I think everyone forgets about this one, but involve your procurement teams early to help decrease barriers to implementing changes once you've agreed upon a solution. The most painful thing that happens is everyone's in agreement, you have a plan, but then you don't have the proper channels set up to, you know, with your operations teams to kind of make that fit within your organization. So you definitely don't want to forget to kind of include or kind of engage with them as well.
That's very important to note. I agree. And cross-functional collaboration and, you know, teamwork makes it a dream work.
Yep.
In safety, but also in any,
everything,
you know, successful business and organization. So how would you go about, you know, selecting specific members that need to be participating in the project, for example?
Yep, that's a good question. I think if you're like looking to put in a super formal program, you could probably have at least one contact person from each of those departments that you can reach out to figure out, okay, well, I'm working on this, who in your department can help? But before you do that, you have to know which departments need to be involved in these decisions. So for example, if you anticipate a major design change, you'll likely need to maybe involve your engineering, your procurement, or your corporate real estate teams. Maybe you just need to buy someone a new mouse, and that new mouse has already been vetted and is a part of your equipment standards. In this case, all you might need to do is just purchase them via your procurement system, or just get, make sure that their manager has signed off on budget. And as you kind of like are starting to put together a program, you know, start to take note who you contacted to accomplish what. So in your program, you have, you know, there's an SOP in place. Okay, there's a design issue. I need to contact XYZ from this department, and they can route me to the right person. Outside of this, you can also ask for volunteers to be a part of your committee, especially at that worker level or the management level. You know, there are some people who naturally have an interest in that health and safety, even though it's not a part of their job. And you can ask for volunteers, or you can ask managers and directors to nominate workers who would be a good fit for the team.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. And thank you very much for sharing. It's very important to have the right, you know, people on board before you proceed to implementation. So now that you know who's participating in the project, how would you go about that process of implementing? Because I know it, you know, the right approach can make all the difference. So I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yes. So once you've brainstormed and identified solutions and have the green light from the decision-making authorities, you'll need to begin to think about, again, how to, you know, put that solution into action. So this can be done in phases. You can start by implementing your immediate recommendations and easiest solutions while putting together a plan at the same time of an action for how you are going to implement your intermediate and long-term recommendations. So the reason I recommend doing this in phases is because early successes and quick wins can help build confidence in your ergonomics program. So also, if you are taking that participatory approach where you're involving your workers, the early wins can be a huge source of motivation and provide a lot of confidence for your workers to continuously kind of be involved in this program.
That makes sense. I'm curious, how do you actually know that, the solution is going to work and, have successful outcomes once you start, embarking on that process?
Yes. So that's a good question. So, you don't always necessarily want to like, okay, this is my solution, and then we're just going with it. We're sending it, and
Committing
no one,
100%.
yeah, 100% before you're seeing, does this actually work, right? I think, like in your mind, this is the perfect solution and it's going to work. But, in practice, there are a lot of variables and it may not always be the case. So before full-scale implementation, you'll need to pilot the intervention and, while you're doing that, gather feedback. So sometimes piloting may involve purchasing new equipment or having a vendor or an internal team build a prototype, right? Other times it can be as simple as making a quick adjustment to a process. But it doesn't matter how complex this pilot is going to be and how long, how many people you have to get involved to pilot this. Regardless of the complexity of that solution, the success is going to depend on, properly communicating the change to the workers involved in the process. So you can make a process change, but if no one knows about it, it's not going to do anything. You can gather actionable feedback from the workers testing the proposed intervention. So this part is critical because without that quality feedback, it will be hard to predict what is working and what is not. What you don't want is kind of disengaged work group, or where you present the solution and they just give you kind of like an unenthusiastic shrug, like, yeah, we'll do this. When you propose something and then you're not hearing any complaints, so you just go ahead and implement the change on a full scale, and then you come back to find that people actually took issue to those changes, but they just didn't communicate them. So those changes need to be accepted by workers. Otherwise, the intervention will not be as impactful as it can be. And to ensure that you're getting that quality feedback, you have to define what feedback you're looking for, right? You can make sure you can, provide training on like, okay, well, we're giving you this because we saw these issues and we are looking for these issues to be corrected specifically. Are we correcting these issues, right? So be very clear. And you can even give evaluation checklists based on risk factors that you are trying to reduce.
Right. I hear you. Maybe you can provide us like an example of getting such a feedback.
Definitely. So a very common example of this is when an organization is trying to standardize on an ergonomic task chair for their offices, maybe just one building or maybe all of their locations across the board. So this can sometimes be a huge feat, and it involves a lot of things that I won't get into, but one of the aspects of the process is sometimes involving the employees. So you select a handful of employees to provide feedback on maybe the top 3 choices that you've narrowed everything down to. However, unless these employees are trained to do so, many people don't actually know what to look for in a chair, right? So as the facilitator of this process, you need to let the employees know what features make a task chair a good ergonomic task chair. And you need to let them know like how that chair should fit them in order for them to be able to give you good feedback, right? Because if someone just sat in a chair that wasn't adjusted well for them, or they didn't realize that they were supposed to be sitting in this way, there are so many factors that could impact why they chose that of the 3 that you offered them. Maybe they just liked how it looked, right? You want to make sure that you're giving them criteria. So you can give them a checklist. You can have an expert or a consultant help you identify those characteristics and kind of walk those employees through it. Again, that'll help them make a more educated decision, and it'll give you the feedback that you actually need.
Interesting perspective. Thank you for that, Amonit. So where do you go from there? Do you move on to, like the full scale implementation once you've ran the pilot and gathered feedback, or, something else?
Yeah. So once you gather that feedback, this is where you kind of go back and make modifications to your original proposal. And then you're going to have to test the solution again, right? So if you make changes to a process, collect feedback on how those changes went, and then look at your initial solution and see what's working and what's not working. You might have to do this a couple of times before you can move on to full scale implementation. Sometimes you might not. Sometimes you probably will. And then even when you think about full-scale implementation, you might have to do that in phases as well, right? So this is always going to be a process, continuously improving. Maybe your intermediate solution is a process change that you are going to implement for the next 1 to 2 years. And then you might highlight another solution that you are gearing up to implement in the next 3 to 5 years. So for the sake of simplicity and not getting too into the weeds, I can share an example of how this could be applied, in a situation where someone is doing office or computer work.
Please do.
Let's say, Sophia, I'm an ergonomist and I come and evaluate you working, and you're a scientist in the lab. But you
no. My ergonomics would be terrible.
It's okay, you have me. You spend 4 hours per day on the computer, and then you spend the rest of the day in the lab. But even though it's only half of your day, that exposure to the computer work is a lot. And it can start to build up after some time. So let's say you're working in that role for a year, and you're noticing that every time I go sit at my desk, my neck, is hurting a lot. So you reach out for an ergonomic assessment, and during the risk assessment, we identified that the monitor was too high, and this was causing you to bend your neck up for prolonged periods. Mm-hmm. So to address kind of at the micro level, the physical ergonomics issues, an immediate action that I would take is provide you some ergonomics training, just so you know how you should be sitting in that chair. And then potentially in this environment, you don't have a lot of adjustability. Your chair raises up, but your monitor is fixed. So I would raise your chair up higher. And then I found a box that you can use as a footrest for now, so that your feet aren't floating in the air. However, after testing this out, you identify that the box is not a stable support and it's too tall for you. And also that your monitor is still too high because you're still bending your neck up. So as an intermediate solution, I would work with kind of vendors and specialists and my procurement team to buy you a footrest that is adjustable in height and is a bit more stable, and also find you an adjustable monitor stand or a monitor arm. So this was my first kind of like ergo assessment within this organization, right? And then as time goes on, as things happen, more and more people kind of come forward with these similar complaints. You start to notice some trends. And so for this specific employee, you have solved the risk factors associated, like for you, I've solved the risk factors associated with your office environment. But now, while I've done that, I have a process for how to address this for future employees as they bring complaints. And even though this is reactive, for the foreseeable future, you have an intermediate process in place, right? Mm-hmm. If you want to kind of address this from a more macro organizational level and have some more long-term solutions, there's a couple of other things you can do. So even you can even make immediate changes when you are looking at this from a more macro lens. So like I was saying, this is my opportunity to start writing a process in my ergonomics policy document for people who reach out when they do have an ergonomic complaint. Like, one, how do they reach out? Who do they reach out to? And two, if the equipment is needed, who is responsible for purchasing the equipment? Where is the budget coming from? And then as time goes on, and I still have this reactive process in place, I'm going to take notes so I can kind of keep streamlining it. Mm-hmm. As an intermediate step, you can set up a framework for organization-wide ergonomics training resources potentially. So, maybe at first you're only offering trainings to people who raise their hand and say they want a training. But maybe that training eventually develops into something more regular, maybe something for new hires or something on an annual basis. And while this is happening, again, take notes, make kind of like look at the lessons that you've learned and adapt your model, right? So some organizations, an annual training works great. Some organizations have so many annual trainings that no one wants to take it. So it just becomes another barrier. And then some organizations are fine with kind of e-learning or recorded video trainings or just providing kind of, paper resources. Others need some more high touch. And this is really just going to depend on the culture of your organization. But in this intermediate kind of realm that you're in, you want to make sure to kind of collect that feedback so that you can keep making changes. And then as a long-term step, you can start having discussions with kind of your real estate teams that are responsible for making furniture decisions, right? So poor Sophia had to sit at this desk that didn't have an adjustable monitor for her, but why not for the future when we do buy new equipment for everyone, just like we're moving into a new building or something, why don't we set some criteria for future equipment, right? As an ergonomic standard, it needs to be adjustable, blah, 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 things like that. And in this case, you can, recommend that all of the desks have to have an adjustable monitor arm or stand so that we don't have this issue in the future.
Love it. These are fantastic examples, Amona. Thank you. It makes it very easy, to understand what you mean. Would that be all to consider, or, are there any other, next steps that are related to people who, let's say, who are starting their program from scratch, are in the middle of building it, or who already like have something in place?
So a lot of what I'm saying, it kind of started from the beginning as if you didn't have a program in place. You're doing this for the first time, because we do have, a significant chunk of our audience is kind of in that boat. So, if you are, again, as you're going through this process, and you are starting from scratch, best advice I can give is just to kind of take baby steps and write down what has worked and what has not worked, because eventually you're going to want a formal policy document, kind of like it's your source of truth. You have a standard operating procedure when things come up. When you have you have something like that in place, it becomes much easier to manage this whole program and process. But it's very overwhelming, especially if you have multiple types of kind of work environments. Like if you have office, you have lab, you have manufacturing, and you're trying to address all three of those, it can be challenging, right? So take baby steps. One, the first thing that I would do maybe in this scenario is, because this part is your intervention and implementation phase, prior to this, you should do your risk assessments and kind of gather the high risk areas. Choose one of those high risk areas that you identified. Maybe pick one that's kind of easy to address through training or small equipment purchases, and go about addressing that, right? So first, you want to see who you want to involve kind of in the development of the solution. Like, are you coming up with the solution? Are you going to have your workers help out? Identify who you should reach out to help you implement the solution once it's agreed upon. And, once you've kind of done that, start working with those groups, make notes on how you can engage them, and what scenarios you will require that same person's involvement in, and any issues that you face. So kind of, take notes the first time you do something. And then as time goes on, every time you go about addressing a new risk that you've identified, follow the same process over and over again. This will help you slowly chip away at developing an SOP for future scenarios. For those of you who have a program in place, first step might be to kind of follow up on any solutions that you've already implemented and see if they're working or not, right? So if that's not already a part of your process, it is important to kind of go back to see if you need to modify or revise any of your initial solutions. Maybe another thing that you could do is think about the pain points with your current process and see if any of the ideas that we kind of discussed today can help you resolve those. So maybe all of the burden has been on you so far to come up with ideas and brainstorming solutions. So maybe this is an opportunity for you to kind of engage other team members to see if they can help as well. And then, just like with every process, identify those inefficiencies and areas that can be improved, and, start kind of chipping away at improving them.
Love it. Amona, thank you so much for walking us through all of this. I learned a lot today personally, and I hope a lot of our listeners did too. And it's such a huge topic. I feel like we can, continue talking about it for hours. As a little teaser, can you share what points you'll be covering during our next webinar? Yes.
So next time, what we'll focus on is kind of the monitoring results and evaluating the effectiveness of the program, right? So you've done the part where you've laid the groundwork, you've identified your stakeholders, you have processes for risk identification, you have processes for implementing the solutions. And now you want to think about, okay, well, now that I've done this, how do I monitor how my program is working, and is it effective? So we'll spend some time on that. And then another kind of topic that I've added was actually inspired by a request from the last session. So kudos to whoever asked that. But I thought it was interesting, and it is definitely, a challenge. So we'll also spend some time on kind of how to create your equipment standards, and also just talk about some tips for standardizing on global, like on equipment globally. So I know that can be a challenge because, not every country is going to have the same vendors. So you might not have the same products available, et cetera. And if that's something you're looking, if that's something you're struggling with, invite you to definitely join us for the next session. And if you have any ideas or anything that's worked for you, feel free to leave those in the comments, because we can share those as well.
Sounds great. Thank you very much for sharing. I look forward to it. Very excited. We can now move on to our Q&A session to make sure we can address any questions that are coming from our listeners. I haven't seen any coming through just yet, but we have several minutes left. So for those of you who are still here, please send your questions in the Q&A function. And Amonat will be happy to answer these. I'll also launch poll on how did we do. I think Amonat, it just shows that if we don't have any questions, it just shows that you nailed it. You touched on everything. But we would appreciate it if you let us know how did we do, because we always strive to do better and improve. 1% of improvement every time makes all the difference. And we'll give everyone a minute. And I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. It's always a pleasure. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you for answering the poll. Let's give another 10 seconds.
Okay.
I see Justin sent us a question. Is Tumiki looking to more actively get into office ergonomics?
So that is something that we have been considering, given requests that we have, from our a lot of our customers. Again, our product team is looking into it. I don't have a timeline or really any promises on what to expect there, but it is something that we've been talking about internally.
Awesome, thank you. Another person asked, I think that the biggest challenge that I have is locating all the different assistive equipment.
Yes. So when I guess this is always going to be a challenge. I think sometimes the best place to start is maybe one, see if someone else, again, within your smaller or larger team has had to purchase anything similar, because a lot of times that happens, right? Especially with larger organizations, you might have equipment you purchased here and it works well for them, but you would just never know about that. And so that can be probably the path to least resistance and getting what you need. Another place would be to start with your vendors, right? I'm sure as kind of health and safety teams, you have to purchase PPE from places, you have to potentially, there's some equipment maintenance that you have to do. And a lot of those places also provide those different kind of assisting equipment. So that's maybe a good place to start to help you narrow your search. And then from there, you can, like I said, start referencing some of those different technical standards to help you, kind of really qualify some of the equipment that you're looking at, just to make sure that it does what you need it to do.
Thank you, Amonat. One last question, I guess, coming from Clark. Can the hand strain index or joint overlay technology within your system be used for office ergo evaluations?
Yes. So as a first step, if you are trying to perform office evaluations, and you are using the product, I would definitely recommend reaching out to your customer success manager, and they can kind of walk you through the different ways in which you can use, Tamiki to help with those concerns. But, you could always potentially look at performing a RULA evaluation or the revised hand strain if you're looking at specifically, discomfort in the hand or the wrist. But again, feel free to reach out to whoever your customer success manager is, so that they can kind of walk you through best practices there.
Agreed. Thank you very much, Amonat. I know we are at time. Thank you again for all the attendees for your questions and your time today, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
All right. Thanks, Sophia.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining. Bye.